So I've said before, there's good research, there's bad research. What do I mean by bad research? I mean research, almost all research in this area, like almost all child welfare policy, starts with the idea that we should place a high value, we do place a high value on best interest for the child. And yet, there's a lot of research, the stuff I'm characterizing as bad research, that moves right on, and in fact, fails to assess whether the programs the researchers are assessing are serving children's interests. So very typically what you see is research driven by the family preservation agenda. And it's research that actually is designed to justify that agenda. So we have a family preservation program like Intensive Family Preservation Services. Let's assess whether, you've got a program that by definition is designed to keep kids at home. That's what that program was. What's the research? Well, let's see if it succeeded in keeping kids at home. Let's ignore whether kids are abused and neglected more when they're kept at home. Let's just focus on whether it succeeds in keeping them at home. Now, the thing I want to emphasize is that Intensive Family Preservation, the story about that research, played out, and now you've got the article by Hennigan and others that I quote in my article. And many, many people will now say, oh yeah, that bad research, that's a shocking story. But of course, that was that, this is now. My claim is that a huge amount of the ongoing research is equally problematic, asking the wrong questions, and sometimes deliberately dishonest. So I will now just sort of very briefly take you through the racial disproportionality movement story. So I spent a lot of my time a few years ago researching this issue. I call this creature a movement, the racial disproportionality movement. I don't think anybody else was calling that. It was, again, like the IFPS movement, one of the most sophisticated and hugely powerful movements that I have sort of witnessed. So what you had in this area was something called the Casey Alliance, the Casey Foundations, monumentally rich organizations, also, of course, in the business of manipulating the media, not just in racial disproportionality, but more broadly. Indeed, I noticed that they're a funder, and of course they're aware of the power of the media, and I'm sure they would love Daniel to think their way. And of course, there are different foundations within the Caseys, and some more problematic than others. So I won't go on about the Casey. So we'll just call it the Casey Alliance. But it had almost all of what I call the child welfare establishment. So in my racial disproportionality article, I list, it's literally a couple of dozen of incredibly powerful organizations. The Child Welfare League of America, the ABA Center on Children and the Law, and on and on and on. All of them lined right up. Most of them, I'm sure, because they believed, because they were told by the Casey Alliance, and the research, it was citing what to believe. So the media was definitely targeted by the Casey Alliance, and there are lots of stories you can see, certainly in the early days, hopefully somewhat corrected by now, in which the media was completely buying into the claim of racial discrimination. So what's the Casey Alliance? What did it say? And it is continuing to say this. I learned a couple of days ago when I spoke at Whittier Law School, there were some people there from the LA child welfare system who were saying, oh, we just got some new money to do this thing called Correct for the racial discrimination that the Casey Alliance has been claiming exists. So Casey Alliance goal was to reduce the removal of black kids from their homes so that it was proportionate to population. The claim was that the fact that more kids are removed and that you have in foster care a higher percentage of black kids than you have in the population equaled discrimination. That was their claim, racial discrimination. So you can imagine why it's easy to get everybody, if you persuade them it's racial discrimination, or even if you just say it, it's easy to get almost everybody to toe the line, because if they don't, they're called a racist, which is definitely what goes on in this area. Indeed, that's what the woman from LA Child Welfare told me 2 days ago, that she tried to raise a question about what the facts were and was immediately accused of being a racist for questioning the discrimination claim. So what was the discrimination claim based I read stacks of reports, because the Casey Foundation, when I say it's active in advocacy, among the things they did was to go to basically every single state and say, we have money to help you solve your discrimination problem, and you should have one, and you should be looking into it, and by the way, we'll fund your research into it, and indeed, we'll do it for you if you like. We just sign us up, we'll be the consultants. And there's stacks of reports, which I read, state after state after state. They all read more or less identically, and every single one of them, the sites came back over and over and over, almost entirely to something called NIS3. So National Incident Studies, there was actually 1, 2, and 3 at the time of that I wrote my article and was first looking into this, and NIS3 did indeed say, I mean, it was kind of puzzling, because this long report, and it said, gee, poverty is a really powerful indicator for child maltreatment. Next paragraph, a hugely powerful indicator. Next paragraph, black and white maltreatment rates are the same. No footnote, no reference to appendix, no explanation, and you think, this doesn't, it seems something wrong here. You know that overwhelmingly, legacy of slavery and much injustice since, blacks are at the bottom of the socioeconomic totem pole. You might expect higher maltreatment rates. NIS3 said no. Everybody, partly because the Casey Alliance picked it up and propagated it, bought into NIS3 must be right. So here's the problem. I mean, the problem in my view is that it's hard for me to understand how the NIS3 authors could have believed what they themselves said, and it's hard for me to believe that the Casey Alliance, full of super sophisticated people, including social scientists, could have believed what they were using. So why? Because the NIS3 claim was in fact false. And the people who wrote the NIS3 also later wrote NIS4, in which they said, oh, now we have more data, and now it seems as if black and white maltreatment rates actually aren't the same, that black are more or less twice that of white and kind of match what the official reports are. Well, that wasn't true either. So I have to rely on the second person you should in terms of doing your work in the future. First lesson is listen to Emily. The second is listen to Brett Drake. So Brett Drake, another wonderful social scientist, by the time we gave a conference on the racial disproportionality issues, had hunted up the appendix, which was published something like a year later, and is this thick. And in the middle of the appendix to NIS3 were the actual data that the people who wrote NIS3 used. So the data they used, these are Brett Drake's slides.
I actually think I may have
See,
it, Betsy,
oh,
so
you can,
give me
that's all right.
1 second.
They can see from this, guys, I only have like 30 seconds. So here are NIS 2, 3, and 4. So 4, they say, we admit that now there's a discrepancy between black and white maltreatment rates. But let's look at NIS 2 and NIS 3. Here's the white rate, here's the black rate. It was always, Brett Drake's stats here, 1.87 higher black maltreatment than white, 1.51 higher, big discrepancy. Both those studies that time, big discrepancy here. What's the difference? A larger sample, so they found statistical significance. Now, when I say, how could the authors honestly have made the statement which they made in NIS3, there is no difference between black and white maltreatment rates, no difference. Therefore, they said, we can conclude, language of NIS3, there must be something wrong with the system, there must be racial bias. That's what they said in NIS3. They did not say there's no statistically significant difference between rates. They did not footnote that what we mean is statistically significant. But more important than that, any social scientist, I hope, Emily, you will agree with this, because I know I'm not one, but it's fundamental that the absence of statistical significance is not proof that there is no difference, okay? There is nothing in the actual difference that existed that could lead a social scientist who's competent and honest to conclude that there was proof of discrimination. Yet it was on that basis that Casey Alliance made its case to the world, which was believed. So here's another Brett Drake slide. You can see that the differences more or less match the difference in NCANs, which is official reporting. Roughly all the same part of the world, no evidence whatsoever of racial discrimination there. Now, that doesn't mean racial discrimination couldn't exist, but there's an absence of proof that existed, and that's what they relied on for proof. Now, I won't go into it. I think there is lots of other good evidence, much of it presented by guess who, Emily and Brett Drake at our conference, that actually black maltreatment rates are higher than white for all the obvious reasons. So, out of time? So I'll just very quickly say a few words.
You can take all the time you want.
No, that wouldn't be fair. So that's racial disproportionality. I guess I just would like to point out, although we hoped to, quote, change the conversation, derail this movement, I think maybe we helped create a conversation, but I do not think this movement has stopped in its tracks or derailed, and I think that's, something for you all to think about in terms of what you notice going on in the world out there. I want to say a few words about the early prevention and protection, because the net of my work on this article was to do the conference on racial disproportionality. The net of that conference for me was, can't we persuade the world that there's higher black maltreatment rates because for all sorts of unjust reasons, blacks are growing up disproportionately in horrible neighborhoods, living horrible lives, and their kids are, as well as the parents, victimized. And we should do something about the problem, not pretend there isn't one. And so let's do something about the problem. Let's focus on early prevention, and in my view, I wanted also to focus on more early coercive intervention. And so we held this workshop, I guess about a year ago, and that both Daniel and Emily were at, and I thought it was going to be upbeat. Finally, Betsy can be upbeat and friendly, and it was sort of. I mean, there were, I thought, some exciting things being presented about, we get more information from Emily about how we could do better targeting for early supportive forms of intervention. We also had some interesting, powerful data from Emily that I cite in the PNP article that shows that relates to what she showed us today, how miserably our system is doing, which I would think would point, I know she doesn't think it necessarily points there, but to earlier, more coercive intervention. But what I found at this conference was I just found myself depressed by the fact that the family preservation ideology seemed to be ever present, both in the nature of the policies being discussed and in the nature of the research being done. So just couple of examples of that, and these relate to some things I know you're going to hear from future speakers on. So one is early home visitation. I'm a mad fan of it. We had some great presentations. Deb Darrow's going to come here and talk about it. But ever since 1999, I guess, I've been saying, well, if everybody who knows home visitation knows that a third of the families aren't being reached, and that because they say no. It's a voluntary program. They say no, thank you. And most people I've talked to, everybody I've talked to who knows this field says that of course those are the higher risk families with the kids at the greatest risk. Why won't anybody other than me and Henry Kempe in 1976 talk about mandatory home visitation? Well, we won't because we value individual adult parent autonomy so highly that to even mention the word mandatory makes most proponents of home visitation blanch and want you out of the room. And yet Henry Kemp in 1976 could say, why? Why isn't it just like compulsory education? Or shouldn't it be? Why couldn't we understand it that way? So then drug courts, I wanted something on drug courts, because again, it's something I see as a really positive development, or I used to see it that way, because it's saying to parents, we'll help you, a dual promise, we'll help you, the parents, get access to drug treatment and actually get this horrible thing of drug addiction off your back. But the other promise was to the kids. If your parents can't get off drugs, we'll help you kids move on in a timely way to a nurturing family. That was the dual promise that made me excited about family drug courts. What depressed me over the years was, surprise, surprise, one promise got dropped. That was the one to the kids. It ended up, most family drug courts throughout the nation, and be interested in what you learn at next week, maybe, you might ask some questions along these lines, focus mostly on keeping the kids at home and are not doing very well about moving kids on in a timely way to adoption if the parents aren't getting it together and getting off the drugs. The other thing that worried me is that family drug courts aren't reaching infants. So I'm worried a lot about infants born drug affected. It's a huge population, as you mentioned. It's a lot of these underweight kids. They do badly. Of course they do badly. They go home as super fragile, needy, demanding, difficult kids that it would be hard for any of us to parent, however loving, nurturing we might be as parents. And they're going home to people strung out on drugs and alcohol. It's a prescription for disaster. So I managed to find couple of the few programs in the country that are actually trying to reach out to drug-affected infants with the drug court model. But then what does it look like? The Sacramento program proudly states that its goal is to keep every single infant at home, if at all possible. I cannot believe that is a child-friendly policy. I cannot believe that those kids, most of them wouldn't do better if they were moved to concurrent planning into a pre-adoptive family, and then let's see if the mother gets off the drugs or not. And if she doesn't, they could move directly from concurrent planning to adoption. But their goal, keep every single one of them at home. And what's their research look like? The research says, we will tell you how many kids we were successful in keeping at home. Nothing I could see in the research, at least, that they were willing to send me on, and are they abused and neglected at home? And how would the abuse and neglect rate at home look like compared to kids that we moved into a pre-adoptive home? So, my conclusion, I want you to think about moving policy in a more child-friendly direction, moving research in a more child-friendly direction, and looking at research and asking the question whether it is even asking about best interest of the child issues. I want you to beware of the people other than me who are trying to make you think their way. Maybe you can listen to Daniel. And I want you to think about in the future, I think one of the programs you're going to hear from is differential response. Even if I'm successful with others in derailing racial disproportionality, the people who believe in family preservation believe in family preservation. And they are already promoting differential response, and I think they will move to it even more strongly if they can't do their racial thing. And differential response, I think, is highly suspect. It's basically taking those kids that are evaluated out, that pool, 60% of whom, or something resembling that pool, 60% of whom Emily shows you are re-reported, and it's saying, let's treat all these kids, all the ones who aren't getting services under our current system, those must be minor cases, and let's deal with them in a friendly, voluntary system, rather than the coercive system. And from what I've seen of the research on differential response, it is once again only asking the question, how many kids are we successful in using this system on, and or at least similarly narrow questions, rather than trying to say, well, how do kids who are kept at home under differential response and we use this voluntary system, how well does it actually work for kids compared to a coercive system which we gave equivalent services to? So I'm sorry it's taken too long. I'll stop.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I wonder, So we got 25 minutes or so, and then I have to rush you off to the Radisson to get picked up by the cab. So, I'm wondering if you guys have any questions.
Yeah, I think, I liked your perspective. I think it's very, very opinionated. And I read your piece and I think that there's a couple of things that maybe I don't quite understand where you're coming from. And I think that a preservation instinct comes from different cultures. Like for me, and I can say this honestly, that even if I was to be like hit by my family for some reason, I'd wanna stay at home with my family. And I noticed a lot of people in my high school who got the belt, let's say, for punishment or whatever, they would have rather stayed at home than be moved out of their family situation. And I feel like sometimes the interest of the kid is to stay with their desire to stay with their family overcomes that desire to be moved out of the system, and by moving them out of the system, it almost creates a new set of problems out of their family unit, because they feel like, I've been moved out of my unit, there's trauma, then there's this social situation that occurs with this child. And then maybe you meant with like highly strung out drug addicts and alcoholics, but I think there's different degrees of abuse that go on. Like obviously it's not all the same levels of abuse, and so I was just wondering, I guess, where you draw the lines. And I think also that we have to be careful of racial biases and racial perspectives, because there are, like, I come from an Indian perspective, you come from a white perspective. Approaching a situation and saying that a certain child needs to be moved out of their house, from that perspective, you might see abuse as flicking someone, whereas I see abuse as hitting someone with a baseball bat. I think that there's never gonna be a uniform formula for that.
Well, you've asked so many or posed so many questions, issues. I will very briefly address it. I mean, I think it's very rare and should be that kids are removed for anything that we in this room, like you, my guess is, would call physical discipline.
Okay.
Of the kind that you seem to be describing. I think, yes, if there are bruises, social workers aren't gonna like it, but removal of the child, I believe, now there's fights over the facts constantly in this area, but I believe happens when it's way more severe than that. And when it's a physical discipline crossing, that is not being done for any good motive, that is crossing the line to torturous. So, but it's, you know, there's fights over those facts. I am very skeptical of the line, the child often, and social workers will say this all the time, the children always want to stay at home. My sense is children don't know what they kind of want in an educated sense, in that home is all you've known. Of course you want it compared to some anonymous emptiness out there. So I think often, despite a child wanting to stay at home, they ought to be removed. But then I would also say, foster care is not as good as it should be in my view, because I think if you remove them and then let them sit in foster care and then send them home and then re-remove them, that's not great. Is it better than if you just left them at home? I'd still say very often it is, you know, so people knock foster care. My understanding, and I did ask Rick on this, so correct me if I'm wrong, because I couldn't believe it when I first heard it, but that the annual rate of abuse, and I believe this would be abuse and neglect, identified abuse and neglect in foster care is less than 1%. Well, that compares amazingly well to the re-abuse rate when kids are sent back home from foster care, and when they're kept in home once identified as abused rather than removed. So I think, you know, it's easy for people to say, oh, the state's always a terrible parent. I think that foster care and that Rick Bart's research helps show it really does function as a rescue institution to a significant degree. It would work much better, in my view, if we were more ready to move more of those kids in foster care on more promptly to adoption and not leave them in limbo. On the racial bias point, I'll just say, you know, in the rest of my work, employment discrimination, I mean, I'm constantly challenging racial bias. I believe there's tons of it. I believe there's lots of unconscious bias. I actually believe that in this area of child welfare, there's been so much talk of racial bias, of the need to keep kids in their racial communities, etc., that I think, although I think it is countered I'm sure there is both bias and counter bias. The studies, and I've tried to look at all that I've been able to find of social workers, because I looked at them in connection with the racial disproportionality article, because one of the claims of the movement is, oh, we need more black social workers, and we need, you know, instead of the whites with their bias who are over removing kids. If you look at the studies of the social workers, they fail to reveal bias. They fail to show that the black social workers are more likely to keep black or white kids at home than the white social workers. They just don't reveal that bias. Now, that doesn't say it doesn't exist. I think you should talk, because I think your studies of what that you presented at the Racial Disproportionality Conference and others that you were aware of that sort of look at, well, let's look at unbiased measures like deaths and other markers for abuse where bias wouldn't play in, help show the absence of bias.
Yeah, I mean, a few things. I mean, you know, when I look at the data, do I think that that there is some bias that factors into how many children are reported or substantiated or enter foster care? Absolutely. There's some bias in just about any system that that we interact with. I think it's just a small part of the explanation, and I think that what Betsy's speaking to is that for the longest time it was thought to be the primary driver. So when the child welfare system sought to kind of adjust the numbers, it was assuming that most of the bias came from caseworkers and that we therefore needed to retrain these caseworkers. I think it can be thought of a little bit differently, and this is certainly what Betsy was speaking about. I got an email the other day from actually someone who is a caseworker who had read kind of the recent race article, who said, you know, for the longest time, you know, I kept looking around and being like, I don't think, and this is actually an African-American caseworker, I don't think I'm biased or my colleagues are biased. I've always thought it's that kind of some racial biases contribute to the risks that then contribute to the populations of children who become involved in the system, but this is the first time we've probably had the numbers to look at it. One of the reasons I think that is if we take a really objective marker of child well-being, that would be a preventable death before the age of 5. Okay, there's, you know, if a child dies, you know, we as a community, as a society have failed. And I've looked at some very broad definitions of preventable deaths, and what I have found is absolutely consistent with what we see in the child maltreatment literature, which is that we have roughly comparable rates of preventable death among white and Latino families. We have lower rates of preventable deaths among Asian children who tend to be underrepresented in the child welfare system, and we have higher rates of death among African American children, and these are young children. The vast majority of these deaths occur in the home, so we're not really getting into kind of the community violence. But what I will also say is the minute I throw in all of those risk factors, poverty, birth weight, maternal age, the race effect completely disappears. So, you know, what really emerges is that it's not a race-specific effect, it is the conditions in which one is trying to parent that are kind of universal. And so if you are a poor white struggling mother, you know, the potential for maltreatment is no different than if you're a poor Asian mother. It just happens to be that the distribution of those risk factors is very different across races and ethnicities in this country, or at least that's my read. And that's kind of the primary, looking at the death piece has been that's what I've tried to look at as something outside of the child welfare system. There's a great quote from an anthropologist, which I'm not going to remember right now, but she basically said, kind of preventable child death may be the most culture-free measure of child well-being that we have. And so I've kind of taken that and tried to look at it, and it very closely aligns with what we see in the official maltreatment data.
But I think by racial bias, I meant by, like, so far we've only had, like, you three, for example, you guys are leading the discussion, but you also have a white perspective in the issue. And the peace speakers that we've had have been white perspective issues. So what I'm saying is when you said that we should determine what's right for the children, who determines that? Because your determination of it might be different from an African American, might be different from an Asian, might be different from a Hispanic leader in the community. What is right for the child? How can we decide that on a uniform basis?
And I think that's a very valid point, and I don't think it's something we're ever going to be able to escape. I mean, I think we've been really talking about what do we think the true numbers are. And what you're talking about is what is the appropriate response and how is that culturally driven, and I would agree, and certainly what we do in one state might be different from another, and the US versus others, and there's no, again, universal, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Harold.
Yeah, you
People.
can do it.
I saw that hand first.
Yeah.
Coming from the planning perspective, it seems, I mean, we talk about this all the time. I'm taking this health and planning class, and with African Americans being disproportionately as far as having diabetes, and we don't say that McDonald's is racist. It's that, but the way that the city is set up or the way that their community is set up is that they're disproportionately susceptible to those unhealthy environments or unhealthy vices that help them to get diabetes. So I really like your research because I think when it is important to bring the African American view in, but I think your research kind of points out that this is affecting your community and this is how it's affecting your community, and then it's kind of our job through the media and, you know, as a planner to say, you know, what are we going to do about these things, and, you know, and getting the community into the conversation. So I think your research is a starting point, but I think it's definitely important to like show that, like, get into these coalitions, getting to these organizations at the ground level and saying, like, this is the hard evidence. Now what are we gonna do about it?
Well, I mean, the beautiful thing, I think, with your latest piece where you look at public health insurance, right? So people on public health insurance and white families are white children are entering the system at higher rates, slightly higher rates than black children.
Right.
So it eliminates, I mean, this notion that races are different gets kind of obliterated, and it becomes really a question of that neighborhood you're in and all the rest. I mean, there's other factors that have brought us to the place where we're at, but it means we're a lot closer, I think, and you guys might think differently, but I think it makes us a lot closer than we may have thought we were.
There's another thing I think that jumped out at me from Emily's data, which was like one of the figures I wrote down, 30% of black kids are reported by age 5 in California. Well, what does that say about damage to the black community that's gonna be there tomorrow? You know, I mean, if 30% of the kids in the black community have suffered abuse and neglect as a child, what does that mean in terms of their future educational prospects, employment prospects, et cetera? So, I mean, I think one of the things that, it's, you can think about race in so many different ways here, but I think one of the things I feel, and I suspect Jim Dwyer is going to talk about it too when he's here, is you could see this as, which many do, as sort of victimization of the black parents. But if you focus on what's happening to the black kids, is it discrimination to intervene, or is it discrimination not to intervene? And if you think about, I mean, one area where there really is what I might call discrimination and a racial impact is the removal, which does happen sometimes, of substance-exposed infants. So why? Well, we mostly report those infants in poor hospitals, so it mostly is black mothers who get reported. Now, does that mean, we're discriminating against black mothers, or does it mean we're discriminating against white kids because they're not getting reported and removed in cases where they desperately need to be? So, I just think thinking about it from the child's perspective and from the future community's perspective, it's a devastating thing that's happening. And I think on this, both sides of the debate would agree to the black community that this many black kids are being abused, neglected, and removed. So what's the solution to it? I just think the solution, if you think it's really happening, shouldn't be just stop removing. It certainly should be to address some of the discrimination, housing, employment, and make up for historic discrimination that has caused the situation to exist.
To go back to the adult bias and adult rights, I absolutely agree with you on that, but I agreed with you on that before I read the article because I've watched this play out a number of times to some very small, very vulnerable kids. And so when I read your article, it was, well, of course. But obviously that's not the way the discussion has entirely gone. And I came to this by watching face to face, watching these couple of children. I'm wondering
As
what.
a social worker, or were you
No,
working
my
on-
mother ran a daycare.
I see, yeah.
We watched a girl who was with her grandmother when she came get returned as a reward to her mother for getting clean. Well, as soon as she's out of jail, long enough time they stop testing, she goes back to using, and the child goes back to getting beat up or whatever, and then she goes back to jail, and the entire thing keeps going. While her 16-year-old sister had said, I'm not going back to that, and the court said, fine. Like, if that child doesn't want to go back, why are you studying this one? But I mean, I watch this play out really close range every single day. That was enough to convince me. What do you think is missing from the media, though? What would change people's minds without seeing this play out? Is this just not getting reported enough from the point of view that you propose, or is it being reported wrong? Why don't more people come to this?
Well, there are a lot of people, indeed most people in power positions disagree with me and you, okay? So I see my voice as the dissenting voice, and I do what I can to get it out there, but that's why I started off saying, in my view, there's a real need to change a mindset very broadly in society, and I think it's, but you know, partly there's a very deep sense in our society that, you know, individual autonomy is a high value, the keeping the state out, that, you know, and
And I subscribe to that a little. I mean, I have
Yeah.
to say, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that part of it is
Yeah.
that, I mean, I don't think we have that many examples of government systems that work very well or work very effectively. And so, you know, I become a little nervous about the idea that government would be making these decisions. As I've shown, we're not very good at decision making, and so, you know, it's really tragic when we get it wrong on that end, but what if we also get it wrong on the other end? So I think that that's kind of the main thing. It's the autonomy, and it's government's not, I mean, I don't know.
Well, I mean, to what degree, and I want to get you in because you have a question burning, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to be very quick, and then you jump in, and we're running. This sucks, but you know, I
I
always
mean that it has to end.
yeah, that it
as
has to
such.
end.
Yeah,
No, that this just
Right.
is awful. But that you know, what I always saw that was important about Betsy's work was that it forced a conversation about what we're not doing, and it's hard to articulate. But also like what Jim's work, where you start going to saying we need to do more intervention, forces us to think about why we would have to do more intervention, which means we have to get to that first thing you said, which is a big anti-poverty campaign. You know, and I think that unless we can see the reality of how bad things are, or maybe they're not so bad, but I mean, I think your research looks like our surveillance system isn't so great, and our system for treating stuff is not so great, so we need to get to a bigger place, and I think that somehow, you know, having the rod there and something that can make people viscerally face their privacy and their autonomy and all those things forces a broader conversation, I think, but.
Well, I want to sort of jump onto that, because I do think the best argument for the other side, I of course think I'm right, but I think the most powerful argument for the other side is this can't be right. You know, we had slavery, we've had all sorts of discrimination since, we have black communities living in, too many people at least who are black, living in really rotten situations. Now we'll take away their kids? That can't be right. It's got to be that what we ought to be doing is redoubling our efforts to solve the social justice problem. So, and then I guess my only answer to that is, can we do both? I mean, is it fair to these kids to, in my view, trash them? Because we ought to focus, you know, why do you have to say it's one or the other?
We've got time for 2 more questions.
Right. Like I have so much. Yeah, I have like pages and pages of notes. But so I was listening to you on WBUR, I think yesterday. Was it yesterday?
On NPR about
NPR,
international adoption.
And we were talking. Yeah, it was about adoption. And I totally agree with Daniel. And I feel you guys are on the same thing. Like we're treating a lot of the symptoms, and there's not like the root. We're not digging into the root. And so from a PR perspective, like, this is about changing the conversation, being persuasive. And what do you think we're fighting against when it comes to, just as far as mindsets go? What do you think we're fighting against when it comes to adoption, especially interracial adoption? Like, what do you propose that we do about the general perception of what that is? Like, people belong to their race, people belong to their families. Like, where do you believe that starts?
See, I do think it comes back to valuing adult rights over child rights, and that you have to get people to take seriously thinking of children as having rights. So, you know, in the international context, where kids are sitting in institutions, it comes completely naturally to more or less everybody to say, well, if the only reason they're there is poverty, of course you shouldn't free them up for adoption, even if they're gonna live there for the rest of their childhood. And I think, you know, why? I mean, of course it's unfair that some adult, you know, because of poverty, because of lack of birth control, had to abandon her kid to an orphanage. Does that mean the child ought to spend the next 20 years there and having their life wrecked? Because some adult has been treated unfairly. If we really valued children's rights equally, I think we would address a lot of these problems really differently. But we don't. And under the Constitution in this country, adults have rights, children don't. Children have, you know, there are laws that protect their interests. But I think that's part of why the US is, you know, the only country essentially, except for one without a working government, that hasn't signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It says children have rights and that they are full-fledged human rights holders, and we don't subscribe to that. And I think that not that the Constitution seems to matter that much to people, but it kind of feeds into how all the laws in this area actually are structured. So to terminate a parent's right so the child could be freed for adoption, under our Constitution, our US Supreme Court has said you have to prove by clear and convincing evidence. For Indian kids, it's the criminal standard, beyond a reasonable doubt, before you can terminate rights, because the parent has a right, and you don't weigh the child's best. You can't, under our law, when you're looking at terminating rights, even look at the child's best interest. You have to first decide the parent's unfit, because it's considered violation of parent rights to even consider the child's best interest. So that's just an example, but I think this idea that children actually don't have rights is just deeply embedded in our culture. And, you know, it's also comes naturally to adults to value other adults, I think.
Last question, then we'll hear from you folks, and then we'll go.
Okay, I wanted to thank you both. I really enjoyed your research and I really enjoyed your article. And I would like your opinion on something, because on the whole family preservation strategy, I'm curious if one of the reasons that isn't so popular is because on the superficial level, it's seemingly the most economic strategy on the superficial level. And I'm assuming that policymakers would realize, okay, if we're not gonna uphold this family preservation model and we're willing to intervene and put a lot of these kids in foster care or adoptive homes, that's gonna cost money. And that's money that they may have, may not have, or they just may not be managing well. And I'm just curious about your opinion on that.
I think you have a lot of very smart students. I think that's dead on. I think the reason, among the reasons for the popularity of family preservation is you get a left-right coalition. So you get the left saying, we're for the oppressed people, it's gotta be bad to take their kids away. You get the right saying, it saves us money. And the left says to the right, we can save you money. You know, we just leave the kids at home, we can save you money. And so everybody's happy. And is anybody, or either side, really paying attention to the children?
Right, thank you.
I gotta do final thoughts. We gotta catch Kev.
You get to do that.
Okay. Final thoughts. First, I feel like this came up in at least one question. I don't think we have hard and fast evidence, but I would say that one of the things that journalists can do that maybe the public is not aware of is I think that there's still this perception that we're really talking about, the spanking gone a little bit too hard, that we're really talking about kind of these We have a spectrum of acceptable parenting behaviors, and we're talking about cases that are falling just a little bit, say, left of center. And that maybe wasn't my experience when I worked in the child welfare system. It has not been it's not what I've heard when I've spoken to people who are still working in the frontline system. And I think increasingly, as we're able to do a better job with the research in terms of looking at both the short and the long-term health consequences for these children, it would not suggest that that's what we're talking about. And so I think that's one really important kind of reframing, is that we are talking about kind of these really outlier cases. And there are certainly a number of families who may be struggling and maybe where the parenting is not ideal. My own parenting is not always ideal. But I think that some of those cases make their way, and I do not think that that's the majority of the cases. And I think the other thing that I haven't quite figured out how to do is, and maybe you guys have some ideas, but I also think it's how do we engage the public more broadly. It kind of feels like these are somebody else's kids. People really become engaged in the topic of educational reform because all of our kids are in a part of that public system. Frankly, if you have money, your kids are not going to end up in the public child welfare system. Now, if you have money, you're also probably likely to be less burdened, and so you're also less likely to maltreat your kids, but it's really easy to ignore that system. And so, some of the data that I've been working with, my hope is that it will highlight that it's actually impacting more children than we previously thought. And I think a lot of other researchers who are looking at some of those longer term consequences are also able to highlight, if we're not investing and doing more to support these children and families now, trust me, we're going to see them again later. And again, I don't know how you guys weave that into an exciting story, but generally when we hear about the public child welfare system, it's when a child died, and those are, that doesn't tell the whole story. So
I just want to underline Emily's first point there, because a huge amount of the debate over should we do more or less family preservation, more or less intervention, is waged over the issue of how bad are these cases really. And the regular claim of the family preservation people, the racial disproportionality people, the differential response people is, oh, we're over removing. And one of their claimed justifications for that is, look at, a majority of the kids removed, it's just neglect. Why, that's just the dirty house case. That's the alleged fact. I think you're completely right, but this is a disputed fact out there, and it's so important because the differential response people are saying, oh, we should stop having coercive intervention in 60 to 80% of the entire caseload. They're just minor cases, and we can just have this voluntary system and it'll all be friendly because it's just minor, these people just need help. They do need help, but it's major help, and it's not clear the help will have any impact soon enough to help a child. So that's really important, and really important to sort of press some of the policymakers on.
I'm just going to say one more thing on that, which is that I think that part of that is also that historically it was that the child welfare system was when parents couldn't support and we didn't necessarily have other means. But I don't think that is the child welfare system we have today. And I think that the neglect cases, as Betsy points out, are cases of very generally severe substance abuse or maternal depression that really have a real impact on the children.
It would be so interesting to see child death rates during the 90s. When you had such a high, balloon foster care system, and see if there was any. I don't know, maybe it wouldn't matter. There's so many other extraneous factors. Yeah, it's not a gold standard.
Yeah.
Well, guys, thank you very much. I'm sure we're gonna